With everything that's taking place right now in Minneapolis and across the country, I thought it would be appropriate for me to share the unique background that I have when it comes to the issue of racism, because I have a story growing up that I think really adds a perspective to this dialogue that isn't talked about very often. You see, I came from a pretty sheltered lifestyle. I grew up in a Christian home, and I was homeschooled by my grandparents who lived next door. So I lived a pretty sheltered life, kind of away from the rest of the world growing up. And because of this, I had something peculiar happen with me that was kind of a rare phenomenon, which is that I would read in my history lessons about how racism was in the United States, about the history of racism and certain acts that people took out of a racist mindset. But it was always in the past tense. And so I believed, up until I went to college, that racism was something that only existed in history. That it was something that once existed and no longer existed. That it had been long past. And my grandma, who homeschooled me, told me that the only difference between someone who was black and someone who was white was a difference in pigmentation of their skin. And that's all it was. And I accepted that. That's all it was a difference in pigmentation. And I truly believed that racism no longer existed in America, but was something of the past. And it wasn't until I went to college that I discovered this wasn't true. You see, I went to college in Minneapolis, and there were people that talked about the struggles of racism and problems that the black community faced that the white community didn't face. And I began to hear for the first time in my life that racism still existed. And it was shocking for me, because I'd grown up my whole life knowing that all it was a difference in skin pigment. All it was a different look on the outside, but believing that we were all still people on the inside. That the only difference was skin deep. And so when I discovered that there were still people who felt discriminated against, it broke my heart. I couldn't believe that something so barbaric in my mind, something so far away in the distant past, was still something occurring in our world today. And this had an interesting effect on my life, because it was as I was discovering all of these different issues and hearing about the different issues that people faced and hearing about how we needed to be sensitive to these issues. It was the first time in my life that I ever considered treating someone differently because of how they looked. And not treating somebody more negatively, but rather being more careful around them. Being careful of what I said. Being mindful not to say anything that would upset them. You see, up until that point, I had never considered black people as any different than white people. And so I never even considered treating them differently. And it wasn't until I discovered that racism was still an issue today that I even began to consider being more mindful of my words and my actions around somebody simply because of how they looked. You see, hearing about racism is what caused me to look at someone differently because of how they looked on the outside. When I was growing up and believed it was something in the past, and truly believed that it was not around in our world today, treating someone differently because of that would have never crossed my mind. And it wasn't until hearing that I should be sensitive to those needs, those issues, that I should be aware of what I say and what I do, that I should check my privilege, and that I should be aware of the struggles of others. It wasn't until then that I even considered treating someone differently or seeing them differently. And as I've started to process this journey that I've been on in my life, I've come to realize that a lot of the problems we have in this area comes from the fact that we still believe it needs to be addressed today. I truly believe that. Because it wasn't until people told me that I needed to be aware of it and that I needed to address the issue that it ever became an issue for me. When I believed that it was something that we had gotten past, something that no longer affected us today, I never even considered looking at people differently because of the color of their skin. Because it was what was beneath the skin that counted. And I've come to realize that that truly was the better approach. To be able to take all the wrongs that I read about in history, all of the injustices, and to put them in the past. Not to keep bringing them up in conversations today, not to keep bringing it up and talking about how it was an issue, but to simply let those things that were in the past stay in the past where they belonged. And I think that's something that we need to consider as we talk about this issue. Is this really something that we need to keep bringing up again and again and again, or is it time to forgive, to leave in the past, and move forward? And I know some people believe that in order to move forward, we have to bring up the past transgressions, that we have to bring up the past injustices, that bringing up the past is how we move forward. But I can testify from my own life that the way I was moving forward was by believing it was in the past. And it wasn't until people told me that it was still in the present that it affected the way I looked at other people. We have to come to an understanding that it's skin deep. It's simply a difference in pigmentation and nothing more. And take the injustices and transgressions and leave it in the past, and instead focus not on what divides us, not on what is different about us, but instead on what's underneath, what is the same about us. And as we focus on what is the same, the things that we share, it will move us to closer unity. Because you cannot focus on the dividing factor and expect to come to unity by focusing on what makes us different. Unity only comes from focusing on what makes us the same. Think about it this way. Have you ever considered the indifference or the injustices between people who are tall and people who are short? That's probably something that has really never crossed your mind. About tall people being treated differently than short people, or short people being treated differently than tall people. And why is this something that we've never even considered? It's because it's something that we never talk about. We don't divide people up by tall people and short people and talk about how tall people are treated differently than short people and short people treated differently than tall people. Although that's definitely true. People are treated differently based on all kinds of differences that we have. But when we focus on what makes us different, that's what causes divisiveness in our mind and in the way we view people. And if all of a sudden we start talking about how the difference between tall people and short people is an issue that is in our world today that needs to be addressed, if we started doing that, then we would come up with issues that never existed before we started talking about that. Now, it may not happen in the generation alive today who have been told over and over and over about how there's a difference in treatment because of a difference in look. Now, I'm not completely ignorant. I know that there are differences in ways that people are treated because of how they look. I'm aware of that. But if we keep dragging that baggage with us into the future, then we will never be able to leave it in the past. We have to put the hatred, the divisiveness in the past. Because I want to live in a world, and I want my children to live in a world where they believe, just as I did growing up, that the hatred, the transgressions, the divisiveness was an issue that was, not an issue that is. So that when they look at other people, they aren't looking at the surface. They're looking at the person underneath. Classifying people by what makes them different in a way that they can't control. Not a difference of opinions, not a difference of actions that someone has taken, but a difference in the way that they're born is detrimental to our society. And it's an issue that even the early church faced. When Christians were just starting to teach people about Jesus, there was a lot of controversy over whether salvation was just for the Jews, God's chosen people, or if it included all people, the Gentiles, as well. Was it just for the Jews or was it just for the Gentiles? Who did salvation belong to? Did the Gentiles, if they were able to have salvation, if they were able to have the forgiveness of their sins provided by the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, if that was available with them, then did they also have to follow Jewish law? Or did they not have to follow Jewish law? And if that wasn't required for their salvation, then was it also required for the Jews? And there was a lot of debate about all of this, about the difference between Jews and Gentiles. And there's a verse in Galatians, chapter 3, verse 28, that says, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." You see, when you believe that each and every person has been made in the image of God, and we all share that in common, then outward differences don't matter. The differences that come from a person's birth is completely irrelevant. We need to move past this. We need to stop looking at what makes us different and begin looking at what makes us the same. 18 years I went without looking at someone differently, without thinking about them differently because of the color of their skin. And it was because I believed that it was no longer an issue. And I don't think that provides all of the answers on how we move forward, but I do think it is something that we have to consider. Because there is no way for us to move past this if we continue to bring it up as we move forward. That won't allow us to move past it. It will keep us stuck in the past. We'll be taking our baggage with us and honestly remain in the bondage of outdated mindsets. Because we know it is just a difference in pigmentation. But underneath it all, we're just people. Each and every one of us, we are all people, and we share that in common. And if we stop bringing up all the things that make us different, all the things that divide us, then we can have a future generation that grows up without looking at each other through that lens. And I know, because the first 18 years of my life, I lived that. And it wasn't until people told me that I needed to change the way that I thought and the way that I acted because it was still an issue today that I ever considered doing so. That I ever looked at people differently. Let's stop looking at what makes us different and focus instead on what we share. Let's take these outdated ideas that people are different because of how they look, that they're different because of the circumstances of their birth, and instead recognize that what really matters, is what's underneath, because that's what unites us all. And leave the hatred and divisiveness in the past as we move forward into a new future. Take some time to consider that. Is bringing it up again and again and again, is that helping us to move forward, or is it hindering us from moving forward? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you want to share a response to this or your thoughts about anything that I've said, you can post on our Facebook page, Sermon in the Pocket, or get in contact with me and share your thoughts with me or ask me any questions that you have. You can also do so by emailing me at sermoninthepocket@gmail.com, and I'd love to get in contact with you either of those ways, through Facebook or my email. And if you like this program and want to support it, the best way to do so is by pledging a monthly support on my Patreon. But either way, I hope this has been meaningful to you. I hope it has been thought-provoking. and I hope that God has been able to speak to you through this. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.